Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, this government is completely out of touch, and I don't say that lightly. There is a crisis unfolding in rural parts of this country, in Ontario, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Prince Edward Island, and Newfoundland. A real crisis. A crisis that this government is ignoring. And here is the crisis, Madam Speaker. 10% of Canadians heat their home with heating oil or with propane. 10%. That's 3.8 million Canadians. About 1.5 million households in this country heat their homes during the cold Canadian winters with heating oil or with propane. That's a third of Canadians living in Atlantic Canada. That's over 1 million people living in the province of Ontario. They heat their homes with oil or propane, and the vast majority of them heat with oil. And what many people don't realize, what this government certainly doesn't realize, is that these Canadians are in dire straits. They are facing a crisis this winter. These Canadians, these 1 out of 10 Canadians that rely on heating oil or on propane, are going to be bankrupted by the cost of heating their homes this winter. And here's why. Traditionally, 90% of Canadians heat with heat other than heating oil or propane. They either use natural gas or some form of alternative. But here is the reality for those 10% of Canadians that use heating oil or propane. For a house that is heated with natural gas, for every dollar of heat that house uses in natural gas, that same house located in an area where there is only heating oil or propane, it costs $3 3 times to heat with propane, and it costs $4 to heat with heating oil, 4 times. And these figures I give to this House are before the global energy crisis that has hit global economies over the last year or so. The figures now facing the 10% of our fellow citizens this winter that heat with propane or heating oil are truly, truly frightening, Madam Speaker. And that's why this is a crisis. I went on the website yesterday of West Nova Fuels of Nova Scotia, and I quote from their website. On average, a typical house with 4 people in it should burn about 3 or 4 tanks of oil in a year to heat your home and hot water. About 2,800 liters of oil. 2,800 liters of oil. That's how much it takes to heat a typical home in rural Ontario and rural Atlantic Canada. 2,800 liters. And Madam Speaker, I went on the website of a company called Crescent Oil in rural southern Ontario that services much of rural southwestern Ontario with heating oil. And here's their current price for a cost of a liter of that heating oil. $2. That's right, $2. That's the current price on their website for heating oil. And some areas of rural Ontario and rural Atlantic Canada have even higher per liter costs for heating oil. And Canadians will understand that if they're told that heating oil, number 2 heating oil, is diesel. That's what it is. That's what furnace oil, heating oil is. It's diesel. And if you drive around Ontario in the last week or so, you'll see that diesel is at record highs levels because of shortages of distillates and other heavy crudes. And it's selling for about $2.35 a liter now in Ontario. So it's no coincidence that heating oil, which is diesel, is selling for $2 a liter. That's $2 a liter for 2,800 liters over a winter. That's $5,600 to heat your home, a typical home in rural Ontario or rural Atlantic Canada. And that's before the carbon tax, and that's before the HST. There's a carbon tax of roughly 13 cents a liter on that heating oil. And there's HST, not just on the base cost of the heating oil, but also on the carbon tax. So that $5,600 is going to cost to heat your home this winter in rural Ontario or rural Atlantic Canada actually is closer to $6,739, of which $375 is the carbon tax. And the government's rebates do not cover these costs, because if you're a typical 4-person family living in these rural areas, mom, dad, and 2 kids, heating with heating oil, and driving to work in a 2-income family, putting on 25,000 kilometers a year on each vehicle, because there is no public transit in rural areas, that's the very nature of living in a rural area, you will consume about 5,000 liters of gasoline in a year. And in Ontario, there's an 11-cent a liter carbon tax on that gasoline. That means that you will be paying about $550 a year in carbon taxes for commuting. Add that to the $375 that you've paid on your heating oil to keep your home at a minimal temperature of about 19 or 20 degrees, and you're looking at $925 a year in carbon taxes just on commuting and heating, not to mention all the embedded carbon taxes that are embedded on shipping, on groceries, and other costs. And the climate rebate of $204.88 a quarter for a total of $819.52 doesn't cover the cost. 2 out of 10 households, under the government's own admission, we heard it from the previous member, 2 out of 10 households in this country do not get more back from the rebate than they pay in carbon taxes. And this government is ignoring those households and ignoring the crisis facing these households, ignoring the astronomical skyrocketing costs that it will take to keep one's house warm in rural Ontario, rural Atlantic Canada this winter. And the argument that this is somehow working as part of a plan to reduce emissions to combat climate change is bunk. Here's the proof. They haven't met a single target. They came to office saying that they were going to meet Copenhagen. Well, we blew through that without meeting that target. They said that they're now on track to meeting Paris. It's total baloney, Madam Speaker. Emissions have been rising under this government. In 2016, the first full year that this government was in office, emissions were 715 megatons. In 2019, the last year before the pandemic, for which we have data, emissions rose to 738 megatons. Now, they dropped in 2020, but shutting down the economy is no way to combat climate change and reduce emissions. And I'll go out on a limb here, Madam Speaker. I believe that in 2022, Canada's emissions will blow through that 738 megaton level to a record high for this government. And don't take it from me. Take it from Bloomberg. I was reading the news this morning, Madam Speaker, and I came across an article that Bloomberg just published today titled, "The Prime Minister Defends Canada's Minuscule Climate Progress." A bevy of climate policies championed by Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau have not yet translated into steep pollution cuts in the country. And I want to quote from that article.
Honourable member, he's not to mention the Prime Minister or anybody else by first name or last name, even if he's quoting an article. The honourable member has 1 minute and 17 seconds to wrap up.
My apologies, Madam Speaker. I got caught up in the moment and I made a mistake, and I withdraw that. But I want to quote from this article today because it's damning. Quote, "But all of Canada's peers in the group of G7, but all of Canada's peers in the group of 7, or G7, have managed to achieve economic growth while simultaneously cutting emissions. And Canada's environmental commissioner says the country is struggling to bend the emissions curve. Among the group of 20 major economies, or G20, Canada ranks behind only Saudi Arabia when it comes to per capita emissions and ahead of Australia." End quote, Madam Speaker. That's a damning indictment of how this government's climate change policies are working, including its carbon tax. And so, Madam Speaker, I'll finish by saying this. This is the only government in the G7 that has raised taxes on fuel during a period of record high global energy prices. Even the Premier of Newfoundland and Labrador is pleading for relief. This government needs to get in touch with Canadians and understand that 10% of this country is in dire straits, facing a heating crisis this winter. They need to do the right thing and cut the taxes on propane and heating oil.
Hear, hear.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Health and to the Minister of Sports.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. And, you know, before many of us ever got involved in politics, I would say that we looked to the member opposite from Wellington-Halton Hills as a beacon of hope in the Conservative Party with respect to fighting climate change. We saw him as the only leadership contestant in a race that was willing to talk about and acknowledge climate change. And he, at the time, I believe, was a proponent of carbon pricing, a strong proponent of strong action to fight climate change. And lately, the Conservatives have been telling us to cut the tax, cut the tax, cut the tax, not acknowledging that Supreme Courts across this country have said that it's not a tax, it's a rebate program, and it's actually helping many families who have made many adjustments to their usage of fossil fuels. Madam Speaker, many of my constituents also use heating oil. Many of my constituents also use propane, but the methodology that the member opposite is not going to help climate change, and frankly, it's not going to help our constituents in rural Halton either. I would like to hear from this member, does he still believe in fighting climate change with carbon pricing?
Member for Wellington-Halton Hills.
Well, Madam Speaker, what I proposed in 2016 was in fact a revenue negative carbon tax. And I even said at the time I did not support this government's carbon tax, quite simply because it's revenue positive. Not all of the money is returned to taxpayers. The government has used it for a plethora of programs that aren't working. And in fact, the government admits it itself. It says that 20% of households do not receive more and back in these rebates than they pay in carbon taxes. And so what I proposed is nothing of the sort of what this government is proposing, and their plan isn't working, and the proof's in the pudding, as reputable news organizations like Bloomberg are pointing out.